shutdown ends. After a contentious weekend, Democrats back a plan to temporarily fund the government. We have team coverage. Mideast trip. Palestinian Christians slam U.S. Vice President Mike Pence as he visits Jerusalem. Back in Rome, Pope Francis wraps up a week-long trip to South America. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley tells us why the Holy Father is apologizing. And a celebration of life. One Life LA draws thousands to Los Angeles. We take you there. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, January 22nd, 2018.
While this procedure will not satisfy everyone on both sides, it's a way forward.
The motion is agreed to.
The Senate greenlights a plan to reopen the government after Democrats dropped their objections to a temporary funding bill. It comes after 2 days of negotiations that ended this afternoon as Senate Republicans agree to consider immigration proposals in the coming weeks. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Senators voted 81-18 this afternoon to end the government shutdown after struggling for days to find common ground, letting funding for the federal government lapse and putting hundreds of thousands of federal workers on furlough. The new plan extends funding through February 8th. We have team coverage for you tonight. Correspondent Mark Irons brings us White House reaction, but we begin with Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Today's spending bill keeps the government open for 3 weeks. In exchange, the Senate Majority Leader promises to bring up immigration reform and a solution for dreamers, immigrants brought to the country illegally as kids. Senators now have 17 days to reach a deal. Democrats relent on their blockade of a temporary government spending bill.
The yeas are 81.
81 senators voting to move it forward. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell eased Democratic worries at the beginning of this third day of the government shutdown.
All of us want to make life better for the American people. I hope and intend that we can reach bipartisan solutions on issues such as military spending, immigration, and border security.
I'm confident that we can get the 60 votes in the Senate for a DACA bill. And now, there is a real pathway to get a bill on the floor and through the Senate. It is a good solution, and I will vote for it.
I spoke to Senator Jeff Flake, one of the key GOP senators negotiating that deal to resolve DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
We have 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, but broaden that, add some border security elements that people on my side of the aisle want. I'm sure the Democrats will want some things as well. But if we can broaden that product, the support for that product, we can have an easier time when we get to February 8th.
But Democrats could face backlash. What do you say to people that are disappointed right now from the base?
That they should be encouraged that for the first time in 5 years, we have a publicly expressed commitment to have a vote on the floor of the Senate.
The blame game here on Capitol Hill is an important part of looking at this year's 2018 congressional elections. A Morning Consult poll before the shutdown showed 41% of voters would blame Republicans, 36% Democrats, but a CNN poll finds 56% of Americans say averting a shutdown is more important than DACA. Lauren?
The spending bill isn't just going to keep the government open for 3 weeks. What else is in it?
Well, just for one, it extends the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, which helps 9 million poor kids. Its long-term funding ran out in the fall. That program is now extended 6 years.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. The White House says Democrats have finally come to their senses and realized their position on the government shutdown was indefensible. White House correspondent Mark Irons continues our team coverage. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The president canceled a weekend trip to his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida to be here as Congress sorted this all out. The debate leading up to this shutdown was centered around the fate of those undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders says today they were hurt during this shutdown since negotiations were put on hold.
I think that they should storm Capitol Hill and protest there because that is the place that has held up this discussion. Democrats are the one that shut this discussion down by forcing a government shutdown, by being unwilling to fund the government. We lost 4 days over this process of the conversation that should have been focused on immigration reform.
The press secretary says President Trump's position has not changed. He still wants any deal on Dreamers to include greater border security, an end to chain migration, and the cancellation of the visa lottery program. Sanders says President Trump worked with his cabinet members to make sure the shutdown had as little effect on Americans as possible. The White House called it the Schumer shutdown. Lauren.
How soon will the government reopen now that they have reached a spending agreement?
Well, the White House believes most federal government offices will be able to reopen tomorrow morning at full capacity.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. President Trump proclaims today as National Sanctity of Human Life Day. He says all people, born and unborn, deserve protection because all life is sacred and every person has inherent dignity and worth. President Reagan first issued the annual proclamation in 1984 to coincide with the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, the landmark Supreme Court decision legalizing abortion. Vice President Mike Pence tells Israeli lawmakers the U.S. will open its new embassy in Jerusalem by the end of next year. Pence making the divisive announcement in that holy city while on a diplomatic trip across the Middle East. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee joins us with reaction to the vice president's speech. Wyatt?
Good evening, Lauren. Vice President Pence says the alliance between Israel and the U.S. has never been stronger thanks to the efforts of President Trump, but the president's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital is drawing protests from many, including some Christians. A group of Arab lawmakers being forcibly removed after interrupting the vice president's speech today. They hold signs saying Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. Dozens of Palestinians are protesting Mike Pence's visit to the region. The vice president has met leaders in Egypt, Jordan, and Israel on his trip, but Palestinian leaders refuse to meet with him.
He brought to bear his ideological fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of the Bible in order to punish the Palestinians and reward the aggressor, the Israeli occupier.
In addition, Jerusalem's Christian leaders are not meeting with Pence. Archbishop Michel Sabah, former Catholic leader of the city, says he won't do so until President Trump changes his position.
If he wants to defend Christians in the Middle East, he has to start changing the American policy in the Middle East, to start a new vision of politics built on life, a new life in all countries.
The Archbishop says America's preferential treatment of Israel and Israeli settlements are driving Christians away. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, disagrees. In a Christmas message, he said his country is the only one in the region where Christians have equal opportunity.
We believe in this friendship among people, and we protect the rights of everyone to worship in the holy shrines behind me.
Here in Jerusalem, the capital of the state of Israel.
That U.S. policy change is making Mike Pence very popular on this trip among Israelis. His speech to Israel's parliament today was a first for a sitting vice president. Vice President Mike Pence also talked about the importance of maintaining the holy sites in Jerusalem. He told the King of Jordan the Trump administration supports his country's role as the custodian of those sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Lauren?
Wyatt, I remember when Vice President Pence announced his trip in October, saying he wanted to highlight the plight of the Christians in Iraq and Syria. So what is he doing?
He talked about this at length with the King of Jordan, actually, and talking about protecting Christians and other religious minorities like Yazidis. Pence says the U.S. supports Jordan's efforts to take in so many of those Christians who come into their country and continuing to do so. The vice president told the king the administration is directing $110 million through USAID to help rebuild those Christian communities. Lauren?
Wyatt Goolsbee, thank you so much. Police in the Democratic Republic of Congo used tear gas and gunfire to disperse thousands of anti-government demonstrators. At least 5 are dead and 33 injured. It follows the latest protests against President Joseph Kabila. Catholic churches and activists had called for peaceful demonstrations Sunday in Kinshasa. Church leaders asked Kabila to resign when his term ended last year. 3 more prison guards in France are attacked this weekend, prompting protests for the second week. They're demanding safer working conditions. Nearly 100 security personnel burned fires in front of a jail outside Paris. Union members say they want more than 1,000 additional guards. The government rejected the proposal. Pope Francis is back in Rome following a 6-day trip to Chile and Peru that drew 1 million to his final mass in Lima.
Y sobrellevado también interiormente es una sociedad cruel e inhumana.
In his homily, the Pope said a society without compassion is cruel and inhuman. Francis faced anger on his visit over clergy sex abuse. In Chile, the Holy Father defended Bishop Juan Barros, who has been accused of covering up abuse by a priest. The remarks drew criticism from Boston Cardinal Sean O'Malley. Juliette Lindley is EWTN News Nightly's Vatican correspondent. She joins us, as always, from Rome. Juliette, on the way back to Rome from Peru, the Pope was asked about his defense of a bishop in Chile that he appointed in 2015. How did the Pope respond?
Now, the Pope immediately apologized, saying that he was sorry if the word proof had caused further hurt to the clergy sex abuse victims. He said the word evidence would have been better, and he said that it was tantamount to a slap in the face to the victims. He acknowledged that, but he insisted that until evidence is found that Bishop Juan Barros was involved in covering up the abuses of Fernando Cadima, the worst pedophile priest in Chile, that until such evidence was found, as far as the Pope was concerned, Juan Barros is innocent, and he would maintain that.
Since we last got an update on the Pope on our newscast on Friday, Pope Francis spent the weekend in Peru. Tell us some of the highlights.
Well, the Pope himself, on the papal flight back from Peru, said that going into the Amazon was one of the highlights. So meeting the indigenous people of Puerto Maldonado, and he got there, and the people were in their in the typical traditional dress, and there were chants of "Francis, Francis, you are now Amazonian." And it was a chance for the Pope to emphasize the link between the environment and the indigenous people. And just a few days before, he had been in Chile, where he met the leaders of the Mapuche indigenous group, and there he called on the Chilean government and the Mapuche to find a peaceful solution to the hostilities that have been ongoing for several years now.
Saying violence begets violence. I remember that very clearly. It was very poignant. Now he's back in Rome. I'm amazed at his stamina. What does his schedule look like for the next few weeks?
Okay, so Lauren, tomorrow he has no public engagements. He's taking a day off. Well-deserved rest, let's put it that way. Then Wednesday morning, as always, he will be at the general audience in St. Peter's Square, and most likely he will give a sort of a sum up, a summary of his apostolic trip, as he always does. And then because this is the week dedicated to ecumenism, on Thursday he's due to visit St. Paul outside the walls and for Vespers, where he'll mark the anniversary of the conversion of St. Paul. And then on Sunday, he will visit St. Mary Major. Now, he always goes to St. Mary Major before and after his apostolic trips. And in this case, he will celebrate Mass on the occasion of the Madonna known as Salus Populi Romani. Then Sunday afternoon, he will be keeping up this hectic pace, if you want, and he'll be going to the Church of St. Sophia here in Rome, where he will be meeting the Ukrainian Greek Catholic community. Lauren?
He can better him than me. That schedule keeps him hopping. All right, Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Coming up, hear them roar. Women build momentum in a national movement to end sexual harassment. Plus, my take on the lack of cable coverage of the March for Life. Women's marches on Saturday in support of female empowerment drew crowds across the country, including here in Washington, D.C.
Okay, are we ready for a great victory for women? I thought so. We march, we run, we vote, we win.
The movement began last year following the president's inauguration. Protests were held in cities including Los Angeles and New York, and in the snow in Park City, Utah, where the crowd included actress Jane Fonda. Genevieve Wood, senior advisor at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, joins us now. Welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
Happy New Year to you.
Same there.
The Media Research Center, which is a conservative think tank that identifies liberal bias, found that march that we were just looking at, the networks, the broadcast networks on Saturday spent 6 minutes and 43 seconds covering it. And the March for Life, 2 minutes and 6 seconds. Why? When this Marist poll that just came out shows that 3 out of 4 Americans believe there should be restrictions on abortions.
Because the media doesn't agree with that. I mean, the mainstream media, and yes, it's true, Media Research Center may be conservative, but they count the minutes, they count the seconds that each network, evening news, morning news, does in covering a whole host of things. And you just can't deny those facts. And this is, I mean, Lauren, this is true this year, but it's also true last year. I mean, the march goes on year after year. Hundreds of thousands of people have marched in Washington over the years in the March for Life, and yet they almost pretend that doesn't happen. CBS didn't cover it at all.
And I remember hosting the coverage last year, and people were taking EWTN's all day long coverage because nobody else had footage of it. All right, let's move on. I will be talking about that more later in the program. President Trump, he addressed the March for Life. First sitting president to ever address the March for Life.
Which makes it even more outrageous that it didn't get the coverage it should have gotten.
That's exactly right. And it's a sea change, people were telling me, and has been an inspiration to the movement. But those who are pro-life do not always agree with his immigration views. And I'm wondering how those two are related, and how do they cross each other in any way?
Well, look, we want to be respectful of all life, but there is a difference between unborn children who haven't done anything wrong and people who are in this country illegally. I mean, there are differences here. That doesn't mean that you don't treat people with respect, but there are ways to look at things legislatively to make sure you're being respectful of all involved, not just one group over another.
The Senate reached a compromise today, ending our shutdown, making us have a lot of traffic tomorrow in Washington, D.C., but that's just a very small part of this, a very small part. But they still have to resolve this immigration issue, as you were talking about. And you recently wrote an op-ed saying Democrats really don't want a deal on immigration. Why not?
Well, Lauren, look, there was 2 years at the beginning of President Obama's term where the Democrats controlled Congress and they had the White House. They did absolutely nothing when it came to immigration reform, even though they had talked a lot about doing it. Democrats want to give people legal status, but they don't want to do what is the necessary work of securing the border and making sure that we're enforcing our laws so that we don't have this problem again 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Immigration reform needs to be both. We need to make sure that we're taking the measures to ensure we don't have an illegal immigration problem 5 years from now. A whole population like the DACA population that's here today, if we don't want to have that problem again, we need to make sure our borders are secure. Then we can deal with those who are already here.
Thank you so much. Genevieve Wood, senior advisor at the Heritage Foundation. Up next, star quality. We talk about the turnout for One Life Los Angeles. And truth be told, broadcast and cable networks mostly ignore the March for Life. My thoughts. "45 years ago today, the U.S. Supreme Court recognized the constitutional right to an abortion. That was in its Roe versus Wade decision. Norma McCorvey, the Jane Roe in the case, later became a Catholic and pro-life activist. She passed away last February. As women gathered across the country to protest President Trump and support abortion rights, another group gathered in Los Angeles to celebrate life. Thousands of people rallied to support the beauty and dignity of all human life, from conception to natural death. Damon Owens was one of the speakers in Los Angeles. He's the founder and executive director of Joy to Be, a nonprofit ministry. He covered the March for Life here in Washington for EWTN. Damon, welcome to the program. Tell us how One Life LA is different from the March for Life we saw here Friday in Washington.
Well, I thought it was a beautiful example of what dioceses, even the largest diocese in America, can do really locally to energize people, not just about the genocide or the evils that we're dealing with abortion, but really about celebrating life. I had a good chance to talk with Archbishop Gomez, whose vision 4 years ago was to provide a place to celebrate life. It was very deliberate. It wasn't to ignore, certainly, the evils of abortion and the issues that we're dealing with, but to give an example of what the culture of life looks like. So the mood very much was a festival with great music, good speakers, and encouraging words from really a broad spectrum of the issue.
Well, tell me what the broad spectrum includes.
Well, we had a wonderful presentation from a young woman with Down syndrome who is really an incredible inspiration in how she lives and her swimming and things she's able to do as a witness for those with Down syndrome. We had a witness from someone coming out of the gang culture, talking about the realities of the family life that drew him into it and really the grace of God that drew him out. We had Patricia Heaton, the actress from in Hollywood, who gave great witness. And we had, did I mention the salsa music? The music was just beautiful in the festival, and there must have been 15, 20,000 people. But it really was the atmosphere. I think that was the vision that was executed so well by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. It was just a lot of fun.
As you said, it's the largest in the country, and that you had Patricia Heaton there, but California is also one of the most socially liberal places in America. So what is the pro-life mood there? Was it as ebullient as we saw here in Washington?
Most definitely. I think the great example of that, Lauren, is literally back-to-back marches on the day, on Saturday, where there was the women's march that happened very earlier in the morning, followed by One Life LA, and then there was another immigration march. I mean, I was making jokes with the Angelinos, like, is this your typical Saturday? And they were like, no. But along that spectrum, even in LA, as you said, very socially liberal, this was what was beautiful about Archbishop Gomez's vision. It was so positive, it was so joyful, and yet it did not ignore the real serious cultural issues that we have. But I think the tone and the approach and the people that were there gave such a beautiful witness to what the culture of life looks like. It's not about being against. It's really about the beauty of what this life does for a culture.
Damon Owens, founder and executive director of Joy to Be. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
How many of you know On Eagle's Wings? How many times have you sung it at Mass? Well, pro-lifers at the March for Life got a rare glimpse of real eagles during Speaker Paul Ryan's speech to the crowd. Take a look at this picture. It was sent in to us. You could barely see them, but there they are. Two bald eagles flew over the National Mall, this patriotic symbol of the U.S. at what's being called the largest human rights demonstration in the nation. Finally tonight, I don't do this very often, but here is my commentary. Two marches and two very different versions of media coverage. The 45th annual March for Life in Washington, D.C. on Friday brought tens of thousands to the nation's capital, as did the women's marches on Saturday protesting President Trump and advocating abortion on demand. Yet, watching cable television on Friday, coverage of the march to defend the unborn virtually ignored. CNN and MSNBC taking only the president's remarks, defending life in the Rose Garden. Even Fox News, which covered it, didn't give it much airtime. On the broadcast evening news, the Women's March, according to the Conservative Media Research Center, received 3 times as much coverage. Why? Because the progressive agenda too often drives media coverage in our country. It's far from responsible. In fact, it's highly irresponsible. It's why the public continues to express skepticism about what they see, hear, and read in the media. And it's why EWTN News Nightly tells the stories the mainstream media won't. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. And we will leave you tonight with more from Friday's March for Life in Washington, D.C. Good night, and God bless you.
Left shattered on this empty floor. I've tried so hard to simply keep it. I know there must be something more. I'm here now to turn it over.